There are times in life when the weight of the world presses down so hard you can hardly breathe. Times when the struggles you face seem to be too much to bear. When it feels like no matter how hard you try, the goals you set seem out of reach. It's not just that life is difficult, it feels like everything is against you. And yet, it's in these moments, when everything feels the heaviest, that God is often working the hardest to prepare you for something bigger. It was the summer of 2021 when Sarah Walker first started feeling the shift. She had always been the reliable one, the person people turned to for advice, for help, for guidance. Sarah was a teacher at a local high school in Virginia, a job she had poured her heart into for nearly 2 decades. She loved her students, loved the feeling of making a difference in their lives. But as the years wore on, the burnout set in. She had always put others before herself, pouring everything she had into her job and her family, only to find herself feeling more exhausted, more disconnected from the things she used to love. She had been raised in a Christian household, taught that hard work, dedication, and faith would carry her through any struggle. But somewhere along the way, Sarah lost sight of herself. She had worked tirelessly to be the best teacher, the best wife, the best mother, but in the process, she had neglected her own needs, her own dreams. She had been living in survival mode, taking one day at a time, and it was starting to wear her thin. Sarah had always believed in the power of prayer. She had relied on her faith for comfort during tough times, but lately, it felt like her prayers were hitting a wall. She wasn't sure where she was going or what she was supposed to do next. She felt stuck in a routine that no longer sparked joy, stuck in a marriage that had become more about logistics than love, stuck in a body that was tired, aching, and running on fumes. But it wasn't until one ordinary Wednesday afternoon that everything changed. Sarah had come home from work feeling the weight of the day's events, parent-teacher conferences, a never-ending pile of grading, and a seemingly endless list of things she should be doing. She plopped down on the couch, her body heavy, her mind racing. She had tried everything to find peace: meditation, exercise, even journaling, but nothing seemed to work. It was in that moment of exhaustion that she heard the whisper. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a voice from the sky. It was simply a thought that bubbled up from deep within her, one that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. You were meant for more than this. Your struggles are preparing you for something bigger. The words stopped Sarah in her tracks. She hadn't realized how deeply she had been longing for something more, something beyond the routine, beyond the exhaustion, beyond the endless cycle of meeting expectations. But in that moment, she understood. The struggles she had been facing weren't meaningless. They were shaping her, refining her, preparing her for something greater than she could imagine. It was like the weight she had been carrying wasn't just a burden, it was a part of the process. God was using her struggles to prepare her to step into the person He had always intended for her to be. As the days went by, Sarah began to reflect on her life. She started to recognize that her struggles, while difficult, had been necessary. Her feelings of exhaustion and doubt had pushed her to the edge, but they had also forced her to confront the deeper issues that she had been avoiding. She realized that the burnout she had been feeling wasn't just a sign of physical fatigue. It was a sign that something in her life needed to change. She had been living according to other people's expectations, trying to please everyone around her. But in the process, she had lost sight of her own desires, her own passions. Sarah's spiritual awakening came as a quiet realization. She had been trying to live for everyone else. She had been caught up in the culture of doing, of achieving, of being the perfect wife, mother, teacher, and friend. But God was calling her to something different. He was calling her to step into her true purpose, to embrace the gifts He had given her, and to trust that He would guide her through the uncertainty. She began to pray with more intention, asking God to show her the next steps. She realized that the shift wasn't just about changing her career or her circumstances. It was about changing the way she saw herself and her purpose. It was about stepping into her power as a woman of faith, a woman who was made for more than just surviving. She was meant to thrive. Sarah's breakthrough didn't come overnight, but it did come in the form of small steps. She began to listen to the desires of her heart again. She started thinking about the things that brought her joy before life became so overwhelming. Spending time with her family, teaching with passion, and pursuing her own interests outside of work. She began to take small actions every day to reconnect with herself and her faith. She started a Bible study group at church, where she shared her journey with other women who were also struggling with the weight of life's demands. She reached out to friends she had lost touch with and began investing in relationships that mattered to her. The more Sarah leaned into her faith and embraced the shift, the more she saw changes in her life. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the fear of stepping into the unknown crept back in. But each time she felt that fear, she reminded herself of the words she had heard that day. Your struggles are preparing you for something bigger. She began to see that her struggles were not a punishment. They were preparation. The pain she had felt in her marriage, in her work, in her own body, had been refining her, shaping her into the person she was meant to be. Every hardship had a purpose. She wasn't just surviving the storm. She was being strengthened by it. And the more she trusted God, the more she realized that her life was unfolding in ways she never imagined. Sarah didn't have all the answers yet, but she had faith that God was leading her. She understood now that the shift she was experiencing was not just for her, it was for those around her as well. She was called to help others who were facing the same struggles, to encourage them to embrace the shift and trust that God had a plan for them too. As Sarah continued to step into her power, she began to see the world around her in a new light. The struggles she had once viewed as burdens were now the very things that were preparing her to make a difference. She had always thought of herself as just a teacher, just a mother, just a wife. But now, she realized that her role in the world was far greater than she had ever imagined. She was being called to lead, to inspire, and to help others see the same potential within themselves. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was filled with purpose. Every day was a step closer to the woman she was meant to be. And as she embraced her calling, she saw the ripple effect it had on those around her. Her children noticed the change in her, and so did Tom. Their marriage began to deepen, and they started sharing more meaningful conversations. Her friends reached out to her for advice, and she found herself mentoring women who were struggling just as she had been. Through it all, Sarah realized that her struggles had never been in vain. They had shaped her, strengthened her, and prepared her for the life she was living now. And as she continued on her journey, she knew that God was with her every step of the way, guiding her, supporting her, and showing her the way forward. The world had been waiting for Sarah to step into her power, just as the world is waiting for you. Your struggles, your pain, your doubts, they are not in vain. They are preparing you for something bigger. The time has come for you to embrace the shift. Step into your power, trust that God has a plan for you, and know that the life you've been longing for is waiting for you on the other side. The world needs you. It's time to rise. For most of her life, Sarah Parker had lived in the shadow of everyone else's expectations. As a child, she had been the quiet one, the one who followed the rules, stayed out of trouble, and did everything right. She went to college, graduated, and got a stable job as a marketing manager in a large firm in Boston. On the outside, she had everything she needed: a good job, a nice apartment, a supportive family. But on the inside, Sarah felt disconnected. She was living a life that seemed perfect to the outside world, but it didn't fulfill her soul. In the midst of this outward success, Sarah had begun to feel a growing sense of unease. She was 48, and her life had become a routine she didn't recognize. Every morning she woke up, went to work, came home, and repeated the same cycle. There were moments when she felt a deep yearning, a longing for something more, but she didn't know what that more was, and she didn't know how to begin looking for it. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet the demands of her job, her family, and society that she had forgotten about herself. Sarah had always been a person of faith, but lately she had felt disconnected from God. She went to church on Sundays, said her prayers at night, but something was missing. It felt as if her faith was more of a routine than a relationship. The passion she once had for God's purpose in her life seemed to have faded. She couldn't understand why she felt so lost. How had she gone from being someone who believed in the power of God's calling to a woman who felt like she was just going through the motions? It wasn't until she sat alone in her small apartment one rainy evening, reflecting on her life, that the truth began to surface. The weight of her struggles, the long hours at work, the constant pressure to perform, the distance she felt in her marriage, had led her to a point of clarity. Sarah had always thought that success meant doing everything right, following the script and meeting expectations. But now, she saw that the life she had built was not her own. She had been living for others, her boss, her family, even society's definition of success. And in doing so, she had forgotten who she really was. She had been afraid to step outside of what was safe. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown. These fears had controlled her for years. She had always tried to live up to an ideal that was never truly hers to begin with. But in the quiet of that rainy evening, Sarah had a realization that would change everything. She had been waiting for someone to tell her what to do, waiting for someone to give her permission to step into her true purpose. But the truth was, she had already been given everything she needed. God had equipped her with gifts, talents, and a calling that was uniquely hers. But she had been too afraid to embrace it. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She felt the weight of her struggles, yes, but she also felt a new sense of purpose. The truth was, her struggles weren't just obstacles. They were the very things that had been preparing her for this moment. They had refined her, shaped her, and were now pushing her toward the life she was meant to live. She realized that the pain and discomfort she had been feeling were signs that it was time for a change, a shift in her life. God had been leading her to this moment all along, and now she was ready to embrace her calling. As Sarah continued to reflect on the shift that was beginning in her life, she felt a deep pull in her heart to step away from her current job. She had worked at the marketing firm for over 20 years, and while she had always been good at it, she had begun to feel like it wasn't where she was meant to be. It was safe, it was comfortable, but it wasn't fulfilling. For years, she had told herself that it was enough that she had a steady job, a good paycheck, and a respectable career. But now, she realized that security was not the goal. She was being called to something more, something that would require her to step out of her comfort zone and trust in God's plan. The thought of leaving her job terrified her. How would she make ends meet? What would people think? And most importantly, how could she leave behind the stability she had worked so hard to achieve? But as she sat in her kitchen one morning, drinking her coffee, the weight of these questions seemed to dissolve. She realized that she wasn't alone in this. God was with her, and He had always been with her, guiding her even when she hadn't seen it. She was being asked to trust, to take a leap of faith and step into the unknown, knowing that God had a plan for her. Sarah knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, fears to face, and risks to take. But for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of peace in the midst of the uncertainty. She had spent so many years trying to fit into the mold that society had set for her, and now she was ready to break free from it. She was ready to embrace the power that God had placed inside her, and to trust that He would lead her to the place where she truly belonged. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. Sarah began to take small steps toward her new life. She started by talking to others who had made similar transitions, seeking advice and wisdom. She reached out to friends and mentors who had always believed in her, and they offered their support and encouragement. Sarah's heart opened to the possibilities before her, and she started to explore new career options, ones that aligned with her passion for helping others. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that God was guiding her every step of the way. Sarah began to volunteer at a local community center that provided mentorship to young women, offering her time and expertise to help them navigate the challenges of growing up in today's world. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but every moment spent with those women filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that this was what she had been called to do, to use her experiences, her knowledge, and her faith to help others. But even as she embraced this new direction, the doubts still lingered. There were moments when the fear crept in again, moments when she wondered if she had made the right decision. Was this really God's plan for her? Was she capable of making this change, of stepping into a role that was so different from the one she had known for so long? It was during these moments that Sarah turned to her faith. She remembered the words in Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. These words became a guiding light, a reminder that she didn't need to have all the answers right now. She just needed to trust that God was leading her in the right direction. With each step, she felt more and more confident that she was on the right path. As Sarah continued to step into her power, she began to see changes in her life that she had never anticipated. Her work at the community center flourished, and she was offered a position to head a new initiative aimed at empowering women in the local area. She felt her confidence grow with each new responsibility, each new challenge. But it wasn't just her work that changed. Her entire outlook on life shifted. She no longer felt trapped in a cycle of expectations. She had stepped into her true calling, and in doing so, she had found a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had never known before. Her relationships also began to change. She reconnected with her husband Tom in a way that felt fresh and new. They began to talk openly about their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Sarah realized that the change she had embraced wasn't just for her, it was for their marriage as well. They had been living parallel lives for so long, but now they were partners in a new way. Tom, who had always been supportive but cautious, began to see the joy in Sarah's eyes that had been missing for so long. Sarah's faith also deepened in ways she hadn't expected. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that she was living according to God's plan for her life. Every morning, as she prayed, she felt a deep connection to the divine, a knowing that she was on the path she was meant to walk. She no longer saw her struggles as obstacles to overcome, but as stepping stones that had led her to this moment. The shift that Sarah experienced was not just about her career or her marriage, it was about her entire life. She had embraced her true purpose, stepped into the power that God had placed within her, and trusted that He would guide her every step of the way. The struggles, the fears, and the doubts had not been in vain. They had been the very things that had prepared her to rise. Now, Sarah stood at the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with purpose, peace, and the joy of following her divine calling. The world had been waiting for her to step into her power, and she had finally done it. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, But she also knew that she was not alone. God was with her, leading her, guiding her, and empowering her to make a difference in the world. The world is waiting for you to step into your power too. Your struggles are not a sign of failure. They are the foundation upon which your purpose is being built. Trust in the journey, trust in the calling, and know that you have everything you need to rise. Now is the time to embrace the shift. You are made for this. When John Miller closed the door behind him, stepping out into the crisp fall air, it felt like more than just the end of another workday. It felt like the beginning of something he had been putting off for far too long. For the past several months, life had been a blur of routine and responsibility. John had been working for the same logistics company for over 25 years, never questioning his path because it had always been the safe one. He'd gotten married to Linda, had 2 children, Jake, who was now 22, and Emma, who had just turned 18, and built a life that seemed stable on the outside. But inside, things had been changing. For the last few years, John had felt a deep unrest he couldn't quite put into words. His life, though predictable, had started to feel like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He had worked hard to get to where he was, but now, standing in his yard on that cool evening, he realized he had been so busy running the race that he had forgotten what it was all for. The fast-paced grind of the corporate world had drained him. His faith, which once guided him like a steady hand, now felt distant and faint, like a long-forgotten song. John had always believed in the American dream, a life built on hard work, sacrifice, and security. But lately, that dream had felt more like a cage than an accomplishment. He had climbed the ladder, built a comfortable life, and yet he felt stuck. The struggles in his career, his family dynamics, and the unfulfilled dreams he had tucked away in the back of his heart started creeping into his every thought. It wasn't just the work he was tired of. It was the fear, the constant fear of being stuck in a life that wasn't his own. John had spent so many years making others proud, his family, his colleagues, even his community, that he had lost touch with what he truly wanted. He was afraid of stepping outside the box, afraid of risking what he had worked so hard for. But something had changed. A few days ago, he had gone to church. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a typical Sunday morning service. But as the pastor spoke about overcoming struggles and finding purpose in the midst of them, John felt something stir in his soul. It was as if a veil had lifted, and for the first time in years, he was able to see past his immediate circumstances and into something greater. The pastor had said, "The struggles we face are not random. They are the very things God uses to prepare us for what He has called us to do." John hadn't been able to shake those words. It was as if they were meant just for him. That night, after a quiet dinner with Linda, John found himself alone in the living room, reflecting on his life, his faith, and the message he had heard at church. His thoughts were interrupted by the gentle hum of his old Bible on the bookshelf. It had been a long time since he had opened it, and as he pulled it down, a sense of nostalgia and longing filled him. He opened to Romans 8:28, a verse he had clung to in difficult times. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." John sat there for a long time, staring at the verse. The weight of it settled deep into his chest. It felt like God was speaking directly to him, telling him that his struggles weren't pointless, that they were preparing him for something greater. He wasn't just meant to work a job, to raise a family, and to live out his days in comfort. He was being called to step into a higher purpose, something more meaningful. His struggles were not just obstacles, they were part of the refining process. But even with this revelation, doubt still lingered in the back of John's mind. Could he really leave behind the life he had built? He had always been a responsible man, someone who made decisions based on practicality and stability. Taking a leap into the unknown seemed reckless. What if he failed? What if he lost everything? He looked across the room at Linda, sitting in her favorite chair, flipping through a magazine. She had been his rock, his support. But he knew this decision would affect her too. Would she understand? Would she support him in this new direction? Or would she question him the same way his colleagues had done over the years? John didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity that he couldn't ignore. The next day, John went into work with a renewed sense of purpose. As he sat at his desk, preparing for another long day of meetings and reports, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. It wasn't just his career that needed to change. It was his whole life. He realized that he had been living for everyone else, his job, his family, his community, and had put his own desires and purpose on hold. The time had come to make a change, to step into the life that God had always intended for him. That afternoon, John called a meeting with his boss, Mark. He had always respected Mark. He was a good man, someone who valued hard work and loyalty. But John knew that this meeting wasn't going to be easy. He had to take the first step in embracing the shift that had been placed on his heart. Mark, John began, I've been thinking a lot about my future here at the company, and I've come to the decision that it's time for me to move on. Mark's eyebrows furrowed. Move on? You've been with this company for 25 years, John.
What do you mean? I'm just not fulfilled anymore, John said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. I've been so focused on providing and being responsible, but I'm realizing now that there's more to life than that. I think God has something else in store for me.
Mark looked at him for a moment, processing his words. John, I get it. You've been a valuable part of this company and I've always admired your work ethic. But if you're sure about this, then I respect your decision. It's just, you've always been such a stable part of the team. It'll be hard to fill your shoes. John smiled faintly, a sense of peace settling over him.
I appreciate that, Mark. But I've come to realize that I can't stay in something that isn't aligned with my purpose. I need to take a leap of faith.
That evening, as John walked through the door of his home, Linda could tell that something was different. He was holding himself differently, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders.
John? She asked softly, looking up from her book. How was work today?
It was good, he replied, his voice calm but filled with a new energy. I handed in my resignation. Linda froze for a moment, the book falling from her hands.
What? You're leaving your job?
John nodded, walking over to where she sat. I've been feeling like there's something more I'm supposed to do. I've been stuck in this routine for years and it's time for a change. I'm going to follow my calling. Linda's eyes softened as she took in his words.
I know this hasn't been easy for you, she said, her voice gentle. But if you feel this is what you're meant to do, I'll support you. We'll figure it out together.
John reached for her hand, grateful for her unwavering support. Thank you. I don't know exactly where this will lead, but I know that I have to trust God's plan. This is the first step towards something bigger. Over the next few weeks, John began to explore his options. He spent time praying and reflecting, asking God to guide him toward his purpose. He knew that his next steps wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't stay in a life that no longer served him. He reached out to friends who had made similar career changes, people who had taken risks to follow their passions. Through these conversations, John began to discover a new direction, one that was aligned with his faith, his values, and his desire to help others. John's journey wasn't just about leaving his job. It was about stepping into the fullness of his purpose. He was learning to trust that his struggles weren't in vain,
They were leading him to this moment of transformation. He was no longer living for security or approval. He was living for God's calling. And in that, he found a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The world has been waiting for you to step into your power. Your struggles, your doubts, your pain, they are not in vain. They are the very things that have prepared you for something greater. The time has come for you to embrace the shift, to step out of the life you've been living and into the calling that has always been yours. Trust that God is guiding you, that He is with you every step of the way, and that you have everything you need to succeed. Rise, chosen one. The world is waiting for you to step into your power. Now is the time.